Watching Republicans flounder over Tim Walz is my new favorite pastime. And you know they've got to be sore after all the straws they've been reaching for on Kamala. Now they're really overexerting themselves. Take it easy, guys. You were going to pull a groin muscle or something with all these leaps. Let's be real. Until bowling becomes a sport, most of you guys are not Olympic athletes. You were not built for these kinds of gymnastics. But I want to talk to everybody outside of Minnesota who's just newly acquainted with the greatest governor in the country. Obviously, if you haven't already, you're going to start hearing the desperate death rattles of MAGA as they try to plead and convince you that Tim Walz is awful. I'm going to be honest, 90% of the things that you're going to hear as criticisms of him is really going to sound like those weirdos are campaigning for him, because the shit that they think is bad is stuff that the rest of us are like, yeah, we want that. And people are like, he's such an extreme leftist because he fed children. Oh. The horror. He's such a communist, he made healthcare and education more affordable for people. Whoa, somebody fire up the bat signal. There's a new supervillain in town. Side note, Emily and I just did a whole Batman and Joker marathon, watched most of the movies. And I don't know why it took so long to dawn on me, but Batman's the baddie. Batman is the villain. Batman is always the bad guy. He spends exorbitant amounts of money on boats and planes and cars and outfits. And then his hobby is running around beating up the poverty-stricken, oppressed people who've turned to crime because they have no other options after being exploited by multi-billion-dollar companies like the one he owns. When all he'd have to do to fix Gotham's problems is just, pay his taxes. Batman is literally Jeff Bezos in a Halloween costume. Jeff Bezos is literally just a less funny Dr. Evil. He's even got the penis rocket. Sorry, what were we talking about again? Right. Tim Walz. Come with me and you'll be in a world of ADHD without medication. So anyway, the weirdos are basically campaigning for him by being like, oh, he fed kids and gave people education and healthcare, and he's building public transit. He protected voting rights and women's healthcare and bodily autonomy. He banned banning books and protected people's rights to gender-affirming care. He gave families paid parental leave. This goes on, and they are genuinely indoctrinated enough that they think that those things are bad. And they're so out of touch with reality that they think that everybody else will think those things are bad too. Because, they're fucking stupid. So go ahead and savor that, because that's genuinely how much they've lost it. But a title you're probably going to start hearing a lot that you probably haven't heard before if you live outside of Minnesota is The Fall of Minneapolis. It was a piece done by Alpha News, and if you're not familiar with Alpha News, it's like a Dollar Tree Fox News from Minnesota. They're an extremist propaganda outlet that does almost no factual reporting whatsoever. They made a documentary about this post-apocalyptic wasteland that is now Minneapolis. And when I say documentary, it's a documentary like, Paranormal Activity is a documentary, as in completely made up low-quality media that's presented in a way that looks real in an attempt to exploit people who are looking for make-believe things to be afraid of. It's the Blair Witch Project, except for, cowardly old white guys. Anyway, I'd recommend not watching it because it's horrible, and anybody with 4 functioning brain cells can tell almost immediately that it's utter bullshit. And if you do want to do your due diligence, you don't even have to watch it, because just about every aspect of it has been debunked by legitimate outlets. But Republicans have this amazing yet wasted talent at opening their throat so they can swallow any propaganda that fits their confirmation bias that they ever have seen on a screen ever. So once again, they're sharing this around a bunch like they did a couple years ago when it came out, thinking that people will actually give a shit this time. No one fucking cares, guys. But if you hear about the fall of Minneapolis or anybody brings it up, now you can be prepared. And basically all of that is based on the next thing you're going to hear criticisms about, which is that, Minneapolis doesn't exist anymore. It was burned to the ground. It's a heaping pile of rubble, a Mad Max wasteland. And this is all based around the premise that there was some rioting that happened over the course of a week 4 years ago after a cop murdered a dude in broad daylight with tons of witnesses around. The whole George Floyd thing, remember that? So yeah, people were a little upset and they set some police stations on fire, broke some windows, did some rioting. And the media focused on these isolated areas of rioting because stuff on fire gets clicks and views. And they made it seem like the entire state had been burned to the ground and was a heaping pile of rubble. That was never the case. Minneapolis was and is a lovely city. I go there often. You can too. See for yourself if you don't believe me. If you don't want to make the trip, Google Street View is a thing. Everything's erect, nothing's on fire. And like any large city, it has its shadier spots you probably don't want to go to certain times of night, but you can walk around pretty much anywhere in downtown and feel perfectly safe and comfortable any time of day or night. And living outside of the cities, it truly amazes me how all of the I will not live in fear crowd is so afraid of the cities. Guys, it's just a place with buildings and good food and entertainment. The scariest thing about Minneapolis is trying to find parking that doesn't cost you $30 when you go down there for an event. I just genuinely don't know how they do it. I can't imagine living life being that terrified of everything. It's got to be exhausting. And for full transparency, about 2020, hindsight is 2020. Sure, there's some things that could have been handled better, i.e. never allowing people like Derek Chauvin to have a job as a police officer. But all things considered, it was actually handled pretty well. It was resolved fairly quickly. It was addressed right away. And it was handled pretty well in spite of the fact that it was a pretty unprecedented time for our city, and Tim Walz still had that new governor smell on him. He'd been in his seat a little over a year. Once again, not nearly the deal they're trying to make it into. They'll probably bring up COVID response stuff because, you know, they're still mad that they didn't have the freedom to go kill grandma with the COVID they got at Applebee's. None of heard them trying to be like critical or discount his military experience. Granted, he didn't go through the harrowing experience of bone spurs, but he did serve in the National Guard for 24 years. The record's all pretty public information, and it's not like he makes his military experience his entire personality like he's Dan Crenshaw or some shit. And then the last thing they're grasping at is a DUI from 30 years ago, which once again is basically campaigning for him because it makes him more relatable. DUIs are like bar door prizes in the Midwest. And after it happened, he quit drinking. He made a mistake and he learned from the consequences. That is like the definition of responsibility and growth. Then the last thing will be you'll probably hear about his rocks and cows statement, which was once again conservatives not grasping context and getting offended about things they don't understand. And the context for that is talking about election maps. On election maps, pretty much anywhere in the country, you'll see little blue dots, which is, you know, cities where the people live. Then you'll see wide swaths of red, which is not the cities where the people don't live. So looking at those maps with all of those rural red districts without any other context, it would look like the elections are being overrun with red. And in the context of election maps on a comedy show, Walz says, yes, but those red areas are mostly rocks and cows. Look, I live with the rocks and the cows. I understood what he meant. Empty land doesn't vote. This 40 acres that I'm standing on right now, if we were in Minneapolis, would have 500 people living on it. Here we have 2. Everything else is rocks and, well, horses and dogs. The cows are next door, both sides. Anyway, his rocks and cows statement was just a statement of fact about population density, and some people got offended because they don't understand population density. Anyway, that's everything I found that, you know, they've dug up on him so far. So now when you hear it, you at least know what it's about. The reality is that Walz is a genuinely good guy. He's been a great leader. Now you can be confident knowing that there's only 2 types of people in this country. People who like Walz and people who are fucking weird.